Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You've successfully joined the workshop on the midterm reliability ruling recently released in the integrated resource planning proceeding. Just a quick request to David to start recording if you haven't already.
Yes, I have. It's recording.
Thanks, David. My name is Neil Raffan. I'm an analyst on the integrated resource planning team. Presenting alongside me today will be Nathan Barcic, the program and project supervisor of IRP, and James McGarry, a regulatory analyst on IRP. We're joined here by fellow analysts David Withrow and Ali Eshraghi hosting this event. Molly Sterkel, the program manager, infrastructure planning and permitting in the energy division, and Aaron Burdick, consultant to the CPUC IRP process from E3. We're very fortunate to be joined today also by 4 CPUC commissioners, President Barcic, I think joining shortly, if not already. Commissioner Raffan.
I'm on. I'm here.
Welcome, President.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil.
Commissioner Raffan, Commissioner Guzman Aceves, and Commissioner Darcy Houck. All 4 commissioners are observing this workshop as panelists, and we really appreciate their interest and involvement. We also have Administrative Law Judge Julie Fitch on the panel as an observer. Welcome, Julie. We also want to recognize and welcome Commissioner Siva Gunda from the California Energy Commission. So thanks for joining us today. And then Siva, if you'd like to make some remarks, now's an opportunity, otherwise in conjunction with Nathan's introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Thank you so much. Just want to thank Commissioner Raffan for having joined the workshop, and thanks to my fellow commissioners observing the event. I would like to just recognize the important role CPUC and particularly the IRP process plays in ensuring a clean, reliable, and affordable future for all Californians, and I'm very thankful for the entire CPUC team for organizing this event. I have the pleasure of regularly interacting with Simon Baker, Nathan Barcic, James McGarry, and Ali Eshraghi on a number of items relating to demand forecast and reliability assessments, as well as the SB 100 process. And there's much of coordination happens at an assessments level, and I am very much looking forward to it, and thank all the staff for their incredible work.
Thanks, Commissioner. Okay, if we advance the slides, I'm just going to lay out some logistics and then the scope of this workshop. There are slides for this workshop posted on the IRP procurement track website a couple of days ago. The slides we're presenting today are slightly different, so please note that, but in general, they're consistent with those on the website. The website is being recorded, with the recording to be posted to the same web page after the workshop. The workshop's not for the IRP proceeding record, but rather to advance stakeholders' understanding ahead of their development of written comments. So, to identify out-of-scope items, I suggest the load serving entity plan aggregation process, which is currently running, and the formation of the preferred system portfolio is out of scope. Some linkages, obviously, but generally out of scope. I'll also note the summer 2021 extreme weather proceeding is largely out of scope, though we will touch on perhaps the interactions there when we're discussing compliance. Then when we, so the purpose is to advance stakeholders' understanding of the analysis that was presented in the ruling and the proposed procurement requirements. So we'll be referring to the ruling a lot. We invite clarifying questions during the Q&A segment, which we'll hold at the end of each topic. And this should help parties to advocate their positions in their written comments. Just some logistics on actually handling, how to ask a question. A couple of ways of going about this. So if you've joined via computer using WebEx, please raise your hand. There's an icon in the participants panel next to you. And then David, the WebEx host, will unmute your microphone and you can proceed to ask your question. And then please remember to lower your hand afterwards. If you're joining by phone, the same concept applied, but on the next slide here, we have the details of how to do that, which is to dial *3 to raise your hand, and then the same to lower it. There is the opportunity to raise questions in the chat room feature of WebEx, typing them. But our preference is if you can raise and lower your hand like I described. That would be the preference. Okay. So with the logistics out of the way, I'll just hand now to Nathan to set the context for the content of the workshop.
Thanks very much for that, Neil. I think before we dive in, it'll be helpful to try to put this kind of focused proposal conversation in broader context. And I'm thinking mostly about the August and September reliability events, the reliability events in Texas a couple of weeks ago. They've largely driven electric system reliability into the front of a lot of people's minds, even in nationwide press, front page stuff, which we don't always see. And a lot of folks on this call, not just the IRP folks that are hosting the workshop, work either full-time or a lot of their time on planning for, worrying about electric system reliability. So we're extremely happy to have all of you with us and all of your brain power kind of on this subject and on this problem. Kind of regardless, we have known for a little while that we were going to need to focus on the mid-decade timeframe, so 2024 to 2026, because of known retirements and some other things that we figured were going to be happening on the system, and make an assessment of what we need as the PUC. So what we've done here in the ruling that was issued a couple of weeks ago that we're going to be discussing is take the best information that we have to form a proposal that we think best suits California's needs. We know that depending on which perspective you take, the 7.5 gigawatts of RA capacity that is kind of the headline item in the proposal might seem big, or it might seem too small. But either way you cut it, we do not take this analysis lightly. We've spent months trying to get this into shape and ready for your eyes. And the LSCs before that spent months putting together plans that they filed on September 1st that form the basis of a lot of this information. So we're hoping that through this stakeholder vetting process that we can sharpen our thinking even more and refine the product. Some of you may have already dug into the stack model itself that accompanied the ruling. Thank you if you have. We're going to try to cover a few of the bigger items in that and that are also kind of attached to the ruling over the next couple hours. One caveat, and this is often implied in long-term planning discussions, but long-term planning, not just for the electricity sector, comes with an element of uncertainty. And in my opinion, that must be embraced, but also mitigated for, and that's what we plan for. In what you're looking at and what we're going to discuss, we tried to strike the best balance we could of reliability, cost, GHG, and IRP's other statutory requirements to produce something that we think will work for California. And just another note that some topics, and I'm going to kind of pick on the planning reserve margin here just as an example, are things that could potentially have scope beyond just the 2024-26 timeframe that we're focusing on here. While comment is welcome on those things that are kind of outside of the scope of today's conversation, what we're going to try to focus on in discussion today is the proposal itself in that specific time window, not for the other possible uses of these things within RA, IRP, or elsewhere. But again, comment is welcome, and you'll see towards the end of our deck today, we do kind of point towards some broader, dare I say, kind of blue sky type things that we would like some party feedback on. But otherwise, I think we can head into the content of the deck. This chart should be very familiar to most folks that have been tracking the IRP proceedings, so I'm not going to cover it in depth. Just to orient you in where we are in the current IRP cycle, in March of last year, we did adopt a reference system plan was passed to LSEs who took about 5 months or so to develop their own plans in response to it and filed all that information with us on the 1st of September. That information forms the basis of 2 big work products. The first is the preferred system plan, which is actually undergoing development right now, but as Neil mentioned, is mostly scope conversation. You will be hearing more about that a little bit later this year. But second, and prescient to what we're talking about here, is a lot of that LSE plan information is leveraged to produce this analysis. On the next slide, we have a sequence of events that is more just for reference. But the kind of punchline here is that we've known about the retirement of Diablo Canyon and other generating units, at least their planned retirement dates, for some time now. And we have inside and outside of IRP started to try to plan and take action for those things. Within IRP, we asked LSEs to kind of focus on what do you think you have to do for your part of system reliability for the mid-decade timeframe in the plans that they filed with us on September 1st. If we go to the next slide, there's kind of a more graphical representation of similar themes. IRP in the top chart here, the 2019 reference system plan adopted last March, and its updated form, which is in the bottom chart, the 46 million metric ton portfolio that we just adopted last month for transmittal to CAISO's TPP process, both in the 2024 to 26 timeframe have nameplate megawatts in the region of about 18 gigawatts, which if you were to convert into NQC, gets you in the ballpark of 7.5 gigawatts NQC. The main message here is that IRP, at least analytically, has been signaling for at least a year this potential need. I guess a long way of, or a short way of saying all that is we don't expect folks to be surprised by what was in the proposal. One of the things that I do want to kind of react to is previously and maybe more focused on the 3,300 megawatt order from a year and a half ago. Sometimes I heard criticism of it being just-in-time procurement, which in my opinion, for parts of it, might be a fair criticism, but it was necessary procurement nonetheless, in my belief, as I think some of the recent reliability events showed. And here we're trying to actually build on that for a different part of the planning horizon and get in front of it so that we can actually plan a little bit better and folks can think about this stuff, digest it before taking action. Nonetheless, for this to not be just-in-time procurement, we do think that we have to move relatively quickly. So on the next slide, we have a summary of the ruling that I won't go into in depth. I'm just going to call out the kind of bigger items that might be new or that we're going to delve into in more depth in a few minutes. We do have a low, a mid, and a high case in that top bullet. And we do, for the first time, at least for IRP procurement proposals, have resource-specific call-outs for thermal and long-duration storage. We also have what we're calling in this, I guess, fourth bullet, procurement responsibility, also called need allocation. We have a new proposed method for doing that need allocation that represents a bit of an evolution from what we use for the 3,300 megawatt order. And we'll also cover towards the end just other requirements, basically compliance, enforcement, et cetera. To put this in the kind of more narrow context of IRP's procurement track on the next slide, I just want to recognize that it can be a little hectic to track IRP from time to time. As a non-IRP stakeholder, we've heard you. We know that it can be a lot of information to wrap your head around. This proposal does exist kind of in a broader procurement track context. Most notably, back in November, we did issue a staff proposal by ruling on a procurement track framework that tries to more explicitly connects between the planning exercises that most of you have come to associate with IRP and the procurement ones that we're seeking to kind of move forward in this proposal. That proposal was workshopped in December, but no comment has been asked yet on that proposal. What we'd like to call out here is that for the 2 buckets of proposals that were in that November document, which are bucketed by phase 1, which means something that might be enacted this IRP cycle, and phase 2, which means something that might be enacted for a future IRP cycle, we are looking for comment on the phase 1 issues particularly the ones that relate to the midterm reliability ruling that we're talking about today. And a visualization of the procurement track framework is on the next slide. I'll just point out very quickly, it's the red portions of this diagram to show the new proposals to establish. You can call them kind of process infrastructure that we're looking to do. That amounts to the red arrows and particularly the red boxes. And not coincidentally, those red boxes actually map quite closely to our agenda for today, where we're going to be covering need determination, need allocation, compliance monitoring and enforcement, et cetera, which were called out in the 3,300 megawatt order from a year and a half ago, but we're seeking to make more explicit as kind of discrete items now. I think the last slide here is just a note on process. The ruling was issued on the 22nd. We are in the workshop right now on the 10th. Comments are due on the 19th and on the 2nd. We have seen a few parties come across an email with requests for an extension on that deadline. We're still considering that, and we're not actually going to be discussing it in today's workshop. And we are for a PD decision by the end of Q2 of this year. So that's another note on kind of the urgency of what we're trying to do here. I think we have a Q&A section right here, just in case folks have questions on the broad stuff, but if not, we can dive into the meat, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And I'll just add a couple of housekeeping points on the questions. It helps if you state your name and affiliation at the outset. And if you keep it to one question per stakeholder at a time, it'll allow hopefully everyone to get a chance to ask a question.
I am scrolling through 245 participants and I don't quite see a hand raised quite yet. So perhaps we can move ahead.
Excellent. Yeah, so we're going to spend the bulk of this workshop is spent on need determination and need allocation, the next two sections. And we'll pause for questions at the end of each of those, as well as the shorter sections. And then at the end when we wrap up. So firstly into need determination. Okay, so need determination is all about determining what's the size, type, and timing of future procurement need. Starting out here pretty generally, this is drawing from the staff proposal that Nathan mentioned. And so in a very general sense, the proposal shows procurement need being found firstly by identifying a requirement, and here that bold line, looking at what baseline resources are expected to be there to meet it in future, what planned resources are expected to be there, and then what's the gap. Very general. And the proposal identifies that there are various drivers of procurement need, from reliability through to greenhouse gas reduction, and then sort of a bucket of other drivers that don't quite get addressed by those two, such as renewables integration. But of course, here today we're focused on reliability and in the mid-decade timeframe. And so there's some degree of urgency and real significance, as Nathan outlined. Accordingly, relating this very general depiction here to the ruling, the proposal here is to focus on baseline resources. And by that, I mean resources that are online now or contracted to be online. And then planned resources are those resources which feature in load serving entities, IRPs, but are not yet contracted and therefore don't qualify for the threshold of certainty for this use case of determining reliability need. And look, a key principle that the ruling takes as well is that procurement need should be stated in as general terms as possible. And so it should be defined by the attributes and services rather than the resource types that could offer those. And so the focus we'll be discussing today is on net qualifying capacity or resource adequacy. for reliability. Okay, so then into the planning standards. And so some background on planning standards. Back in 2004, the Commission adopted a planning reserve margin, PRM, of 15 to 17%. So a range there that was derived from studies assuming that load should not be shed more frequently than once in every 10 years. In other words, a loss of load expectation no higher than 0.1. And so then in the past, the CPUC has used that range for long-term planning, a range recognizing that long-term planning involves contracting for and building new resources, which involves development risk and lumpiness. Whereas in the short-term resource adequacy program, the PRM is 15%. And so then with that background, the ruling recommends a 20% PRM for the 2024 to 2026 timeframe, specific to that purpose of the proposed procurement. It does also seek feedback on whether that higher PRM should be used for long-term planning more broadly. All right, and now to give a bit of an overview of the analysis that the ruling's based upon. And look, this is a summary of what's in the README tab of the stack model that Nathan mentioned is posted and available publicly on the Procurement Track website. So please refer to that README tab for more detail. I'm just going to cover this at a high level. So firstly, the requirement we're looking at for the procurement to meet is the resource adequacy requirement set by the 2019 IPA mid-demand peak load forecast, plus the PRM. So that sets the requirement. We'll refer to resource adequacy quite a lot here. It's meant in a very general sense, not meaning specifically the short-term RA compliance program. And so, I think we should try and be clear what we're referring to as we do this. But much of the conversation today is about the mid and long-term resource adequacy. Similarly, NQC, net qualifying capacity, is meant in a general sense. It's not specifically referring to the accounting currently required in the short-term resource adequacy program, although that does set us with some starting points for assumptions later in the planning horizon. And the bullet here essentially just outline that what we're doing, we look at expected NQC of resources in future years, is we're taking what's online now, subtracting announced retirements, and then adding in development resources. And so then if we go to the next slide and consider not just understanding what resources those are, resource by resource, but what capacity we can assume they'll be contributing to meet reliability mid-decade. That's what the next portion of this presentation is going to explore in a few slide time. And so then on the next slide, just highlighting again that the stack analysis model is available. It is a deterministic model, meaning no macros, no code. In other words, if you change an input assumption, you'll get an output change. And all the inputs and formulae are available for stakeholders to review. The exception to that is that the details of the LSC's in development resources, as per their filings on the 1st of September last year, that should read 2020 last year, is only aggregated in the public in that stack model due to the confidentiality considerations of that. Okay, so now in the next few slides, we'll step through what I'm calling a waterfall chart, which basically bridges where we are now with where we're seeing the system being by mid-decade. To orient you to this, essentially, the left-hand portion of this chart, of this page, is exploring what changes are expected to occur on the requirement side of things, and the right-hand side is then looking at what changes are expected to occur on the resources available to meet the requirements. So the vertical axis is the resource adequacy or the NQC required. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got the various main components of the changes going from now till mid-decade. So the first thing to observe here is the grey boxes, load forecast. By 2026, the load forecast contained in the 2019 IRP is showing a 2.5 gigawatt increase in load in that time frame. That's largely offset by the expected growth in that forecast of behind the meter solar and battery. And then on the next slide, we dive into the planning reserve margin changes proposed in the ruling. Okay, so the two main components here, basically taking us from a 15% PRM to what's proposed being the 20% PRM. First component is 4.2%, or the 2 gigawatt adder, which represents the higher PRM needed to meet 0.1 loss of load expectation according to Resolve and SERVEM calibration that's been performed in the IRP proceeding. Resolve is the capacity expansion model used by the CPUC for IRP, and then SERVEM is the production cost model used also by the CPUC to complement Resolve with more detailed modeling of reliability, production costs, and emissions. Okay, and so the calibration and that exercise was described in 2019 in the lead up to the adoption of the reference system plan in March 2020. But in summary, essentially, the resource, some resource types are getting dispatched differently by the two models. And this leads to the need for the adder. That work found that should be added from 2026. So what's new here is the ruling proposes that this actually start from 2024, given the tightening resource adequacy conditions. And then the second component of this proposed PRM increase is the 1.5% increase to operating reserves. And so what this is referring to is that when the system operator CAISO would start shedding load, previous IRP modeling assumed that would only start occurring when resources have dropped to only being 4.5% above the load. But current CAISO practices are to start doing that at 6%. And so we propose to incorporate that into this higher PRM. The ruling also discusses the load forecast itself, which is interrelated with the PRM, and I just noted has two questions inviting comment on that. This waterfall here gets at one of those points, which is climate impacts. The high need scenario presented in the ruling does include an adjustment for climate impact on load, whereas the mid-need scenario, and that's what's shown here, doesn't assume any adjustment there. And essentially that means it's assuming that the IRP load forecast sufficiently takes climate effects into account. Okay, and then looking at the resource side of the waterfall, we start with the 2020 resource stack of around 53 gigawatts, largely, and in the stack model, these basically are drawn from the IRP baseline with an addition of just 115 megawatts that were in the LSC's IRPs from September and expected to contribute in 2020. Couple of points on the stack. We're aware that small hydro was excluded in the totals, which in error, which results in a decrease in the procurement need of approximately 400 megawatts. This is partly offset by a specified import that is actually solar, not thermal, and therefore has been overcounted. So we're aware of two errors in the stack model, and perhaps parties' comments will identify others. Okay, so this slide is then illustrating the significant retirements we've got. So firstly, the ones through cooling units in the stack model, they're assumed to retire in accordance with the Water Board's decision from last year. Diablo Canyon, the stack assumes that the 2 units coming offline in November 2024, and then the second one in August 2025. And then the other announced retirement we've allowed for is Intermountain, and so CAISO's share of that is considered. The stack model doesn't explicitly address the impact of Aliso Canyon gas storage facility on the future availability and operability of the thermal fleet, and so we would welcome comments or insights on what impact that could have. But I will note that the high need scenario does, in addition to assuming that the retirements I just referred to, does assume an extra approximately 800 megawatts of thermal retirement as part of that scenario based on the age of plant by 2026. So those are physical changes in the system. The final couple to mention here are net qualifying capacity changes. These are based on the existing fleet of hydro and then PV. So the hydro, there's been a significant reduction between the 2020 and 2021 CPUC NQC list for the existing hydro fleet, 1.1 gigawatt reduction. So that shows up here in the waterfall, and we assume that continues through to mid-decade. And then the existing utility scale solar fleet, we estimate its contribution to meeting reliability by mid-decade will decrease by 0.5 gigawatt due to growth in behind the meter solar in that time frame. The final piece of changes in the resource mix by mid-decade, what additions are occurring. And so the LSC's IRPs filed on September 1st, 2020 are the data source for this. As I indicated before, we're focused on in-development resources only, contracted resources only. The definition of those is as per the filings that the LSC's made, and that is the contract status as at 30 June 2020. So if a resource was contracted at that point in time, it's counted in the stack. If it was contracted and approved by the CPUC or the governing board of the LSC after that date, then it's not included in the stack. It's not in the baseline of the stack and the need determination. So for these resources which are not yet online, we applied a viability discount to them. Two ways of doing this. If the LSC's provided viability information in their IRPs, we then derived discounts to apply from those ratings. By mid-decade, these have little effect, but they are stated in the stack model. And then if LSCs didn't have data on viability for their resources not yet online, we applied a 5% discount, which is consistent with the inputs and assumptions we use in the planning track of IRP. And then a bit about the first procurement order, the 3,300 megawatts Nathan mentioned, D191116, which gets referred to quite a bit today, I think. We wanted to carefully make sure in the need determination that essentially we didn't find a duplicative procurement need. Since that order has already been made, we wanted to ensure that we assume 100% compliance to that order, so that we don't find need and then potentially leading to procurement being ordered to duplicate what's already been ordered. And so to do that, staff looked at each resource that's not yet online, in fact, each resource in general, and assessed whether it would be incremental for the purposes of that first IRP procurement order. In other words, would it count towards that order or not? And then where if we found that in each year in aggregate we didn't have 100% compliance, we added generic megawatts to bring that up to 100% compliance, but did that with a 1-year lag. I just note that the table shown here, the middle row here is missing 150 megawatts, but this does not flow through to the bottom row, which is what's used in the need determination. But again, the working for this is all available in the stack model, with the exception of the LSE's development resources filed in their IRPs. Turning to NQC assumptions and how they're assumed to change between now and mid-decade. NQC percentage here refers to the percentage of nameplate capacity that is counted towards net qualifying capacity. And so this table here is drawn from the stack model. It shows the weighted average by technology category. And so essentially the stack analysis takes that, for non-wind and solar resources, it takes this same percentage and applies it for all years of the analysis. Whereas wind and solar, it's more nuanced because we need to recognize the changing conditions in the grid and the impact on how wind and solar can contribute to meeting reliability. And so we've drawn on these, this issue is familiar to IRP modeling in the planning track, and so we've drawn on the Resolve's effective load carrying capability surface, but then we applied the assumptions that are in the stack model to that surface. And so we look at what existing and in development solar and wind there is, look at what behind the meter solar is projected in the IPA, and from that we land on what's the renewable portion of the portfolio expected to contribute in terms of resource adequacy by mid-decade. Now we're looking at the stack. For the system perspective, the attribution between technologies doesn't really matter. What matters is how they combine. But in any case, the LCC worksheet within the stack model does get into an attribution between behind the meter, which is assumed to take the convention used in the short-term system RA program approach. In the worksheet, we've got wind assumed to just be held constant at 15% ELCC, and then utility scale solar gets the remainder of the effective load carrying capability. And so the impact of that is that it goes from contributing an average ELCC of 14% in 2020 down to 9% by 2026. Okay, now with all that, moving to the outcome of the stack analysis, the stack charts here. So there are no new concepts to what I've just walked through here, but just as presenting these things in a slightly different way. So just to orient everyone, the x-axis showing the years we're looking at into the future. The vertical axis again is showing NQC megawatts, and the solid horizontal line, or more or less a horizontal line, is the forecast peak load. That's the managed peak. And then with a dotted line above it, that's the load plus the planning reserve margin in the future years. And then in the column stacks, each different color is a resource type. And those boxes call out the main changes, most of which we've discussed. So the result of this is a shortfall shown in that salmon color up the top, which starts in 2024 in this scenario at around 4.1 gigawatts, increasing to 7.4 gigawatts by 2026. On the next slide, and this is available in the stack model. there's the ability to toggle between scenarios, low, mid, and high, or build a custom scenario. And so this one shows the low need scenario. Two changes from the mid need. One, no PRM increase, and secondly, a much more minor point is no viability discounts applied to in development resources. This ends up being a minor impact because of what I was explaining about the first IRP procurement order. We assume that is met fully, so if there are viability discounts applied, they get offset by those. And then the next slide shows the high need scenario. The main changes from the mid need here are in the load and PRM, we've got climate impacts being assumed. And then on the resource side, we've got 1 gigawatt less of imports being assumed and more thermal retirements, 800 megawatts, like I mentioned earlier. A couple of minor impacts here too from an assumed less behind the meter growth, minor because of when that would contribute to meeting reliability. And then we also assume higher electrification in the load forecast in this scenario, but it also has a less significant impact. And the details of this are in the stack model. So then the next slide pulls that all together and shows a summary table, which is included in the ruling itself. And so it's hopefully reasonably familiar, basically just summarizing the range of outcomes. So looking in 2026, the bottom row, we see the low need being estimated at about 7.5 gigawatts and mid need 7.4 and the high need 10.4 gigawatts. The ruling then takes that need determination and proposes that a significant proportion of it that starts in 2024 should actually be required to come online a year earlier to manage the risk of delay and considering that we're dealing with reliability. And so for example, the 4.1 gigawatts you can see in 2024, 40% of that is assumed to be required in 2023. And then the following year, the same thing occurs. The 40% of the 2025 amount plus what's left over the 2024 amount is assumed to be required in 2024 and so on. And finally, to conclude the resource, to conclude the need determination, what specific resource types or attributes are required to meet the need? And so, as I mentioned, we focus on resource adequacy, NQC, and generally the ruling proposes all source resources to provide that, with the exception that fossil fuel resources would be limited to repowering or redeveloping existing sites. And then the ruling does go on to propose geothermal and long duration storage contribute to the need. 1 gigawatt NQC for each. And the rationale for this is that these are dispatchable resources, reasonably matching the retiring resources, which are firm capacity resources. These geothermal long duration storage would bring greater diversity to the portfolio, and further the ruling builds on findings in the planning track of IRP and capacity expansion modeling for the reference system plan indicates the need for some large and or long lead time items. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind there, covered a lot of content, and we'd like to open up to questions on need determination.
Great job, Neil. You deserve a glass of water. Mary Lynch, you had your hand raised. You are unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. Neil, one question that I had, I wasn't quite following on the PRM. You said, excuse me, that 20.7% is being used for this IRP procurement. But is the PRM for RA purposes in those years still going to be 15%?
Hi, Mary. Thank you. I mean, I think that's a matter for the system RA program. So you know, the ruling and the slide earlier does contain some background on how the two timeframes could interrelate, but the ruling doesn't propose that.
You mean it just doesn't make a decision on that, on what the PRM is going to be for RA?
No.
Okay, so that's yet to be determined.
Right.
Is that okay? Okay, thank you.
Mary Neal, you're unmuted.
Hi, I have a question about the 4.5% operating reserve margin. I don't understand where that came from. Could you clarify that? Was that just an oversight, or where did that come from?
Yeah, I can start and then check whether Donald or Aaron wants to add on. But in IRP modeling to date, our interpretation of the protocols that the ISO would go through was to assume that they would start shedding load at 4.5%. But what's been made clear in the root cause analysis from August last year, and I think looking at WEC-wide protocols on this, is that 6% is the standard. But I'm not sure if Aaron or Donald want to add on.
Well, this is Donald. That's correct, Neil, and that's just been there's a production cost modeling guidelines document that we put out a few years ago that included that assumption, and that's something we've been holding constantly. You know, we've been implementing that way for a few years, but I think right now we are thinking hard about it, particularly in light of the root cause analysis.
And does that mean that all the SERVM LOLE modeling that was done of the reference system portfolio was essentially done with the wrong operating reserve margin?
The operating reserve margin at 4.5%, yes, was was used for previous SERVM modeling.
Donald, if I can clarify the question, and if you have to poke around and maybe come back to the group in a little bit, I think that the question interpreted differently could be, were we using 13.5 unknowingly, or were we using 15 and we're proposing another 1.5 on top of that? So we can get back to that. Thank you for bringing that up, though, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Nancy Rader, you're unmuted.
Good afternoon. Yeah, Nancy Rader with the California Wind Energy Association. The ruling, as you noted, justifies the proposed requirement for geothermal and long duration storage on the basis that retiring resources are firm and because of the need to diversify away from solar and batteries. But under our system of ensuring reliability, the RA program, NQC is NQC, and resources get no further advantage based on degree of firmness. And geothermal will receive a high NQC rating. So it seems that the geothermal mandate would best be justified by its diversity benefit. And likewise, long duration storage diversifies the type of resources we're relying on in that category. So, as well as system integration benefits. So I had three interrelated questions. First, if the benefit of these requirements really has to do with resource diversity and system integration, did you consider that in-state land-based wind energy would also fit that bill? And did you analyze whether LSEs are collectively on track to meet the wind energy targets reflected in the Commission's reference system plan? And second, the ruling does state that out-of-state wind and offshore wind could count towards the ruling's proposed requirements. And I wanted to clarify whether they would count towards the resource-specific requirements or only the NQC requirements. But did you consider also the fact that because of congestion on existing transmission lines into Southern California load centers, any out-of-state wind that's delivered absent transmission upgrades would only displace other imported NQC resources and not add NQC to the CAISO system.
Nancy, that's a good one. I'm going to maybe ask after we try to answer the first two questions for you to clarify your third, because I'm not certain I follow. But as it relates to your first, which I interpret as, did we analyze whether LSCs and their 9-1 filings were quote unquote hitting their in-state wind procurement targets? And I kind of ask about the use of the word target there. We do in IRP try to provide some latitude to LSCs to kind of propose to procure what they think meets their needs. So I think we've kind of avoided using the word target for indications like the ones that you might see in a reference system plan. But I also know that we haven't provided full clarity around just how much wiggle room, so to speak, there is around those sorts of indications. So I understand your position. Nonetheless, the analysis that we performed using that information did look at those resources' contribution to system reliability. So whether or not they were meeting any sort of perceived target, they were all taken into account in terms of what folks told us they were going to be doing that met the specs that Neil described before of, what actually made it into what we considered contracted. On the second question, I think I interpreted that as will wind resources, whether onshore or offshore, be counted towards the, call it generic bucket of NQC or one of the resource specific buckets. For now, the proposal says that they would count within the generic bucket. If you have strong opinions about, how maybe that current construct doesn't map to what you perceive as best, we'd be happy to see it in comments. But would you mind clarifying your third question? I think it was displacement of resources via procuring out of state.
Yeah, if we're trying to add NQC resources to the CAISO system, it seems to us that there's congestion coming from the CAISO, the California border, the CAISO system into California load centers. And so if out-of-state wind comes in on those lines, it will displace other NQC resources and not add resources to the system until transmission upgrades are built into LA and elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll note the ruling does have a couple of questions on imports, and so I think, Nancy, you'd raise content there that would be suitable to put into your comments on those.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. We've got about a dozen hands raised, so we'll try to get through them in the next 10 minutes as quickly as we can. Neil Reardon, you're unmuted.
And Neil, before you go, just quick housekeeping. Those that have had their questions answered, please put down your hand so that we can manage the list. Sorry, Neil Reardon, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for all the information on inputs. It's really helpful. I wanted to understand how you thought about coordinating with procurement and other proceedings. So taking, for example, the PD right now on the extreme weather OIR contemplating 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts of new capacity in the near term. Are you planning to apply that to the supply stack? And if so, when?
Okay, so the stack model makes a clear line in the sand and a clear baseline no. So I guess no. If a resource is not yet in the baseline in the stack model, which was defined as being online or contract as of June 30 last year, minus retirements announced, then it's not in the stack model. So it would count to the proposed procurement for midterm reliability, providing that it serves reliability during that time frame and meets the other requirements proposed in the ruling. So I think if a new resource becomes available as a result of the proceeding you're referring to, it could count to both needs. Just like an RPS resource, for example, could meet RPS requirements as well as this new need if it's not already assumed in the need determination.
Thanks, Neil. Natasha Kiefer, you're unmuted.
Hello, this is Natasha Kiefer. I have a question. I was hoping to clarify the 2 gigawatt IRP calibration. Can you just expand on what exactly that's supposed to represent and why this is being taken into consideration as a planning reserve margin adjustment rather than, if there were some assumptions about how the resource, certain resources, whether they were in-state resources or imports were counting towards NQC, why that isn't being considered on the supply side rather than the PRM.
So perhaps I can ask Nathan to take that. I think, so this is building on the material we had on an earlier slide, which referenced the calibration work done in the lead up to the RSP.
Yeah. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Natasha. It's a good question. So I'll try to go back to kind of the history that Neil covered in that slide a few minutes ago. But your question is, why is something that had its genesis as basically a calibration fix between SERVM and Resolve, why is that considered part of the proposed planning reserve margin in this proposal for these years? And it's a good question. We started the analysis for the reference system plan without that adder. It eventually got worked in kind of mid-process to address perceived calibration gaps. Neil listed the possible reasons for those gaps a few slides ago. They're also available in other public materials. And what we've kind of found is that through looking at the SERVM results after we implemented that 2 gigawatt fix from 2026 onwards, that the results seems like we got in a better place loss of load wise. And we realized that maybe there might be more going on in that 2 gigawatt adder than just the calibration items that we identified. Some of the calibration items that we identified are things like wind shapes, dispatch of different types of resources, counting of different types of imports, unspecified, hydro, et cetera. But it's conceivable that we're in a place now where we need to think about that 2 gigawatts as being maybe not just a calibration fix, quote unquote, and that we need to think about the PRM as a possible construct for capturing other uncertainty or the need to capture possibly more variability that might be involved in either more extreme weather scenarios or on a system where we're relying more on intermittent resource types that we don't really have precedent for trying to measure, from previous cases. Sorry if that's a little bit nebulous of an answer. I think you're looking for something more concrete, but what I'm getting at is we really want strong comment for you guys to focus on what do you think, first of all, the size of any sort of PRM increase should be, and what would its components be? If they weren't calibration issues, would they be other things that you could label with, say, terms like load uncertainty, et cetera, that maybe aren't in the current PRM?
Sorry, just to clarify, has there been any correction? Have any of the calibration issues that you identified been corrected for in the supply side assessment? I guess what I'm trying to get at is there being some double counting by doing the stack analysis and assessing all of the resources available to meet the PRM and then adding the additional 2 gigawatts in the PRM to account for some nebulous adjustment?
So that's a good question. Aaron, you might want to jump in a second, but I'll take first stab. If you're referring directly to like actual resource double counting, i.e. did we include megawatts that we should not have or vice versa, the fixes that we've engaged in so far, I don't believe have done that, but Aaron, please correct me. The main fix that we've done is actually outside of the stack that you're looking at, is in SERVM we have instituted basically a wind shape fix that has narrowed some of that calibration adder down.
Yeah, this is Aaron Burdick from E3. I'll just say that this idea of using a loss of load probability model to adjust the planning reserve margin is actually in common use across other RTOs and other RA programs across the country. So PJM, SPP, ISO New England, they all use this approach of calibrating their planning reserve margins based on LLOP studies. And so I think that's sort of the primary driver of the 2 gigawatt adder, is what's the reserve margin needed for meeting 1 day in 10 years loss of load expectation, which is the IRP's long-term reliability standard. And I think, you know, some calibration updates may have adjusted that. And so, you know, that might have moved around a bit. Maybe it's increased or decreased a couple hundred megawatts, but I think the principle that we need to calibrate the reserve margin we're using to our reliability target still holds.
Thanks, Aaron. Jim Caldwell, you're unmuted.
I had a quick question on slide 24, and that has to do with the OTC plants that got their permits temporarily extended. And you didn't mention those, but were they consumed or considered retired in the baseline, or did you retire them and not mention them?
Sorry, Jim, can you just repeat the last sentence? Can you retire them and not?
Well, I mean, you just didn't mention those when you went through these adjustments. And I was curious as to whether that's because they were not in the baseline in the first place, or because you forgot to mention it, or because you didn't retire it. Is that clear?
Yeah, so I know this slide's got a lot on it, but the first component of the waterfall there, it's 3.7 gigawatts of NQC. That represents the OTC units I think you're talking about. And the retirement assumptions we've made for those is based on the Water Board's decision last year. So it ranges from end of 2021 to end of 2023, I think. And you know, if there's uncertainty about those, and I think there might be, when it comes to 2024 through 2026, it doesn't matter because they're basically assumed to be entirely retired.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You don't need to go any further. I just want to make sure that they were retired in 2020 by 2024.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's try to do a couple more before we may need to move on. Jeff DeTuri, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeff DeTuri from San Diego Gas and Electric. And my question is, what if the resource mix of the proposed new generation is different from the RSP? For example, if there's more storage resources built from this procurement, could there be a potential energy sufficiency issue? In other words, will there be enough energy to charge the storage when it's needed to meet the peak load?
Aaron, do you want to respond to Jeff?
Sure. I would say, just to answer briefly, I think in the midterm timeframe that we're looking at here, we're unlikely to encounter storage charging sufficiency challenges. I think assuming that the gas capacity remains relatively constant, which I think it will need to meet the resource adequacy needs identified here, as well as import capacity. I don't suspect that we'll run into those by mid-decade. I do think in the longer term, those questions should continue to be addressed, and using ELCC analysis, as we've done for storage, to develop the inputs to the reference system plan can help to address that across multiple years and weather conditions.
Thanks, Aaron. Let's try one more before we may need to move on. Mark Specht, you are unmuted.
Great, thanks. This is Mark Specht with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thanks for the presentation. I really appreciate this. I just wanted to ask a broader level question. You all teed up this ruling as meeting the goals of the IRP, including greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But this ruling is really just focused on reliability. And I also noticed that it opens up the door to the possibility of gas procurement to meet the requirements in this ruling as well. And I'm just trying to understand how this ruling will actually ensure that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and actually do things like replace not just Diablo Canyon's capacity, but also its zero emissions energy. So how is this ruling actually ensuring greenhouse gas emissions, since it's just focused on reliability?
Mark, it's a good question. I can take a stab at that. My impression of this ruling, though, to your point, being more or less defined in terms of reliability procurement, is opening the door for a lot of non-emitting procurement that we think can help provide system reliability without actually increasing emissions. I know that we've had offline discussions with the organization regarding kind of different interpretations of specific lines of statute about whether Diablo Canyon retirement results in any kind of increase in emissions. I think that we've already kind of established our thinking on that in decision either D18218 or 19440. But under my or in my impression is that this procurement should be sufficient to be able to cover for a lot of generation that's retiring, a lot of it that's emitting, in ways that should result in procurement, even though we're not being super specific about what type of procurement, that should be able to lower GHG emissions in the medium and long term for California and keep the lights on.
Okay, let's try to move on to the next section. A reminder, there's a raised hand function in the computer, and if you've already asked your question, please drop your hand. And if you're on the phone, I believe it's *3 is the way to ask a question. We'll try to get to everybody toward the end, but let's try to continue on to the next section.
David, just briefly, some housekeeping for all the folks that are still in the question queue. We will try to get to you. So if you can put your hands down now, but then put them back up during future Q&As, we're going to try to get to everybody so that we don't have overflow.
Thanks. And now over to James McGarry on need allocation. I think we're just a few minutes behind our schedule, but doing pretty well. But over to you. Thanks, James.
All right. Thank you, Neil. So hi, I'm James McGarry on the IRP team, and I'm going to walk through need allocation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the different need allocation options that were proposed in the ruling. And the point is to give parties a better understanding of what the ruling says. I'll note at the top that there may be other better options for need allocation that we didn't consider. So if you don't like either option or you want to propose an alternative methodology, then please suggest those in your comments, your written comments. Ruling question number 16 invites comments on alternative methodologies, so please provide your thoughts on those there. We go to the next slide. Thank you. So the two methodologies considered in the ruling are one based only on LSE's share of peak demand, which is how need allocation was determined in D1911-016. And we also proposed one that takes into account both an LSE size and their current contract position by mid-decade. Both approaches outlined in the ruling would allocate out the full 7,500 megawatts of need that was determined in the previous stage that Neil just walked us through, but accounting for contract position in addition to LSE's peak demand would skew more responsibility towards those LSEs with fewer long-term contracts in place now, and so who make up a larger share of the projected capacity shortfall. So in the next few slides, I'll walk through how both methodologies would work and how they might affect different LSEs and LSE types. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll start with the peak share method because it's more intuitive and also aligns with how we allocated procurement in the previous procurement decision. In this approach, need allocation is set just by peak load share, where an LSE's procurement obligation is the total system need multiplied by the LSE's share of peak demand. Next slide. This is a graphic representation of how the peak share methodology works. The green bars on the left are peak load share. LSE1 has a peak load share of 100 megawatts, LSE2 75 megawatts, etc. The middle bars show their share of peak load. So 100 megawatts is 20% of the total load in this example, and so on down the list. And so each LSE's assigned procurement obligation is on the right, and it's derived by multiplying the system need, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, is 100 megawatts in this example, by their share of peak load. So 20% of 100 megawatts is 20 megawatts, 15% is 15 megawatts, 40% is 40 megawatts. Under this approach, the higher the share of peak demand, the more an LSE must procure. So that's peak load share. On the next slide, we'll go over the contract position method, which is what the ruling recommends. As you can see, there's quite a few more steps here than the peak share method. Individual need allocations under this method are assigned based on an LSE's current contract position in the 2024 to 2026 timeframe. The process is a little bit like a miniature version of the system need determination that Neil just described, but it's for each individual LSE. Contract positions here are determined based on what LSE submitted in their September 1st IRP filings. Contract positions are based on the September NQC value of each LSE contract in place now for resources that are currently online or were under development as of June 30th, 2020, and have a contract length that extends into the mid-decade timeframe. Importantly, one thing I want to point out, or two things I want to point out, is that when determining an LSE's contract position, this method gives full credit for an LSE's share of a CAMmed resource and their D1911-016 procurement obligations. In other words, an LSE's mid-decade contract position includes the NQC value of an LSE's load share of CAM contracts, and it assumes that each LSE meets their D1911-016 procurement obligation, whether or not they're procuring on their own behalf. After contract position is determined for mid-decade, their position is then measured against their peak requirement, which is their projected peak load plus PRM. And LSE peak loads in these calculations are based on their 2021 RA load share of the coincident peak demand forecast out to 2026 from the IPR Form 1.5b. And then finally, an LSE's net long or short position is determined by subtracting their peak load plus PRM from their contract position. A negative value in that calculation indicates a shortfall whereby an LSE does not have enough contracts in place to meet their system requirement. Positive value would indicate that they have more than enough in place to meet their peak load plus PRM, but notably our calculations indicate that all LSEs do have a shortfall by mid-decade. Next slide, please. So now to further explain the contract position methodology, I'm going to walk through an example of how this method would work for a group of example LSEs. So in this example, we have 4 LSEs, all of whom are short by mid-decade. The size of their respective short positions vary, but cumulatively, as you see on the left-hand side, they're short by 200 megawatts. In the next slide, we'll see that with the size of the total short position set, we can calculate how much each LSE contributes to the short position. These values are then used to determine their share of total system need. So the share of system need is calculated based on the ratio of each LSE's short position relative to the sum of all short positions. So, for example, LSE 3 has a short position of 100 megawatts. In total, LSEs are short by 200 megawatts, so they have 50% of the need calculation. In the next slide, we can see how that share of system need translates into a procurement obligation. Like the peak share methodology example, the size of the total system need here is 100 megawatts, as you see in the top right-hand corner. But under this methodology, each LSE's portion of the 100 megawatt procurement obligation is set by their share of the total LSE short position. So the percentages in the middle are multiplied by the total system need, 100 megawatts, to determine each LSE's procurement obligation on the right. On the next slide, we will take a look at another example, but digging into a single sample LSE. I want to first note that LSE A is not a real LSE. These are illustrative numbers that I'm using just to further explain the differences between the methodologies. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you can see an example of what an individual LSE stack would look like. Like the system stack analysis presented earlier by Neil, the solid line shows LSE peak load, and the dotted line shows their load, the LSE's load plus PRM. The salmon colored bar is the LSE shortfall between their system requirement and the contracts currently in place in the study years. As you can see in this example, from 2024 to 2026, LSE A has a shortfall that starts at 800 megawatts and grows to 2,600 megawatts. So under the peak share method, this LSE stack doesn't enter into the equation at all. All that matters is the LSE's peak demand, which is 8,500 megawatts in this example, and their share of the system peak. And the system peak is 41,754 megawatts. So that equals 20.4%. That percentage is multiplied by the 2024 system shortfall, 4,146 megawatts. So LSE A's 2024 procurement obligation is 844 megawatts, or 4146 times 20.4%. Now going underneath that to the contract position method, you can see that we are using the LSE stack information. LSE A's 2024 shortfall is 800 megawatts. And in this example, all LSEs have a shortfall cumulatively of 20,000 megawatts in 2024. So the LSE's 800 megawatt shortfall as a share of the total LSE shortfall is only 4%. And when we multiply that by the 2024 system shortfall of 4146, LSE A's procurement obligation is considerably less. It's 166 megawatts. On the next slide, we'll back up even further and see how these two methodologies look when aggregated to the IOU class level based on our current analysis. These are draft results based on a review of LSE plans. You can see through the differences in the height of the blue bars, which represent each LSE type's cumulative procurement obligations under the contract position method, and the gold bars, which represent their procurement obligations under the peak share method. You can see by the differences in height of those two bars, how the choice of methodology might affect each LSE type. In general, IOUs tend to have longer term contracts in place at the moment, which improves their position in the 2024 to 2026 timeframe relative to other LSE types. So their obligation under that approach, while still the highest cumulatively, is relatively lower under the contract position method than it would be under the peak share method. CCAs generally tend to have shorter term contracts, which makes them appear short in the midterm timeframe compared to the IOUs. So their obligation is a little bit higher under the contract position method than it would be by peak share. Similarly, the ESPs tend to have shorter term contracts, so their position under in the midterm also makes them appear shorter, which means that their procurement obligation is higher under the contract position method than it would be under the peak share method. This doesn't count for every CCA or ESP or IOU. This is just when aggregated to the entire class level. So for the next few slides, I'm going to touch on a few key issues that I want to convey about the proposed contract methodology, the contract-based methodology. As I mentioned earlier, we've relied on the individual LSE IRPs, specifically the resource data templates submitted last year to calculate LSE contract positions. When counting contracts, we only looked at those in effect in the 2024 to 2026 timeframe, and that were considered either A, online, meaning that the contracted resource exists today and the LSE had a contract executed in place as of June 30th, 2020, or B, that were considered development, meaning that the resource doesn't exist yet, but the LSE had a contract in place as of June 30th, and that contract was approved by the LSE's highest decision-making authority. The number of contracts that fall into that online or development category has a direct impact on an LSE's mid-decade short position and thus their share of the procurement need, which could lead some parties to think that more recent contracts executed after June 30th and thus a newer data vintage should be used. But I want to stress that the choice of data vintage actually has a very limited impact on LSEs because of how we would measure compliance. If a newer data vintage were used to include more contracts, an LSE might have a smaller short position and thus need allocation, but that would also mean that those newer contracts are in the baseline and can't be counted towards compliance. So with an older data vintage, an LSE's need allocation might be slightly higher, but more recently executed contracts cannot be used to satisfy their procurement need. So that sort of trade-off is something that I want folks to keep in mind. The next issue is confidentiality. Another nuance about relying on the resource data templates or RDTs is that we didn't delve too much, which we didn't delve too much into in the ruling, is that the need allocation was developed using LSE contract data, and LSEs claimed varying levels of confidentiality over that contract data in their plans. So some LSEs narrowly claimed confidentiality for specific fields in their RDTs. Other LSEs claim blanket confidentiality for their entire template. So this raises a basic question about how much we can say publicly about an LSE's procurement obligation. While in the last procurement decision, we published a table of LSE by LSE procurement obligations for IOUs and CCAs under the new proposed methodology, it's not as clear that we can do that given that at least some of the data that we relied upon to make those determinations about procurement obligations, some of that data is confidential. So the question is, how sensitive is information about an LSE's mid-decade short position based on contracts that are in place today? So parties that would want to comment on whether procurement obligations under this method should be considered confidential should do so in their written comments. The need allocation section poses a fairly broad question about need allocation, which you could direct your thoughts on this issue in response to that question. Lastly, I want to address the issue of load migration, which will inevitably occur between now and 2026. The ruling lays out two basic options for dealing with this. The first is to deal with it on the back end, whereby procurement obligations are fixed based on load at the time of the order, and load migration is dealt with through cost allocation. The second deals with it on the front end through a mechanism that allows procurement obligations to shift as load moves around. Both options have their pros and cons as described in the ruling. A cost allocation approach is in line with how we handled the issue in D1911-016. The second option of changing procurement obligations over time seems pretty complicated and could have some drawbacks, but maybe there are ways of doing it that we haven't considered. So again, parties who have recommendations on that question should submit that in their comments. We have a question specifically on these two options. So with that, I'm happy to take any clarifying questions about need allocation.
Thanks, James.
David, a note for those that are putting up their hands right now. I know a few of you are probably going to be holdovers from the previous Q&A section. If you guys could actually just wait for one moment and only focus on questions for what James just presented, and that way we can try to segment out the material.
Thanks. And a reminder, the raised hand function, if you're on the WebEx, if you're on the phone, it's *3. And I should see it. There's about 20 people on the phone. Anu Pandey, I believe you have a raised hand and you're unmuted.
Hi, this is Anu Pandey from PG&E. So I have two questions. They're related. The first one is more of a clarification for need-based allocation. So I think I understood this presentation really clearly walks us through the need-based allocation methodology. The one confusion I have is, let's say, for example, LSEs are given a procurement allocation for year 2024. Is that allocation based on the need identified in year 2024 and LSE's open position in that same year? So that's my first question. And then the second question is related. So this ruling has two, so a geothermal 1,000 megawatt and 1,000 megawatt of long duration storage. How will the allocation for those two resources be made to the LSEs based on this need calculation? Is that based on a single year need calculation? Is that based on an average? Or is there some other way in which these two resources will be allocated to LSEs? So those are my two questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question. Those questions. I think addressing the first part of the question about, I think I'm hearing the question being, what happens if the short position doesn't occur till a little bit later in the planning horizon? The contract-based method would be based on the LSE's open position in each of the years 2024 through 2026. So I believe that a hypothetical LSE whose open position didn't start until, say, 2025 might have a lower procurement obligation in the early years, but their final procurement obligation would be based on their final open position relative to other LSEs. As for how the resource-specific obligations will be allocated to LSEs, I think that is a live topic that we're interested in taking comments on from parties. The ruling didn't specifically lay out how that part of the obligation would be spread out to LSEs. So if you have comments or suggestions on that, we definitely encourage you to submit those in comments.
Thank you.
And I just add there, I think conceptually it would be the same approach as the rest of the resources, but to the point about which year specifically do contract positions get considered for the geothermal long duration storage, that's a portion that's open in the rule, left open in the ruling.
Thanks, Dan.
Ben Montoya, you're unmuted.
Hey, this is Ben Montoya, SDG&E. I have two questions. One, are you using the RDT tables that we just filed to determine position? And the reason I ask that is they kind of freeze our net peak position. It's a static position for all the years when some of us have very high departing load in future years. My second question is local reliability considered in the position? And the reason for that question is, with local capacity retiring in some jurisdictions, there would be a need to replace that capacity anyway. Shouldn't that be determined prior to determining a system position?
Great, thanks, Ben. On the first question, yes, your contract position does come from the RDTs that were submitted in September. So that's where we look at contract position, how that is compared to your peak load. Your peak load is the load weighted share of your 2021 RA obligation as a share of 2021 coincident peak demand. And then that factor is applied to projected peak demand out to 2026, which comes from the IPR. So, the peak demand does vary from year to year. It's not fixed, but your share of it is fixed.
And that's what I'm concerned with, is that our share is changing in those future years. So I'm wondering if that could be recalculated for a future year.
So that's, go ahead, Nathan.
If you have a proposal on how that calculation or how that process would work, we definitely welcome it in comments. It'd be tough to speculate on now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just note that there's a balance between cost allocation and actually changing the procurement obligations. Load migration will continually vary. So if you want the procurement obligations to actually change, I'd suggest addressing how that might affect regulatory certainty and the ability for an NELSE to know and be able to plan for achieving compliance with the order. So that's a consideration that that you should bring into it. And then to your second question about local RA, my understanding, somebody else jump in if they feel differently. We did everything at the system level. If you are going to be procuring in the future to replace local RA, and that resource is going to also provide system benefits, then that would count towards. Like it doesn't change your need determination, but procurement of such resources would count towards complying with your procurement order.
Okay. If my concern was that if someone had a local requirement that was greater than their system requirement, some part of that local requirement might be allocated to others in this case or in that case.
And noted. Please, thank you for bringing that up. Please do put it in your comments so we can address if it needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ed Smeloff, you're unmuted.
Good afternoon. This is Ed Smello with Vote Solar. My question is, in the need determination, was it assumed that there would be perfect compliance with the contracts, or was there some viability metric that was used to discount the contracts in the individual LSE IRPs in making the need determination?
We will try to tackle the determination question quickly now, but I want to focus on the allocation. Can you just clarify what contract you're talking about? What compliance with what?
So you used in determining the need that was assigned to each LSE the contracts that were included in their submittals, and those facilities have not yet been constructed. Was there a viability? I mean, assumption there might be some failure in the completion of those projects. Was there a discount or deduction that was included in the process, or you see from those projects?
For the first IRP procurement order, 3,300 megawatts, when a resource, just like any resource which is not yet online, it is discounted for viability risk. But for that order, we did assume 100% compliance eventually. So the net outcome of that is that it doesn't affect the need determination. Hope that helps.
Well, I guess in the initial allocation of need, that makes sense. But as you look at the actual compliance within the need, then there's some probability that it's going to be some projects that are.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, this is not an exact science, and the actual compliance monitoring of that first IRP order is a separate topic here. And for the purpose of this need determination, we had to.
So I guess the impact on need determination is that there might be, this might go into sort of the justification for the increased planning reserve margin, or a further increase of the planning reserve margin, as is assumed in the high need scenario.
That's possible, Ed, and if you think that's a good consideration, please do include in comments.
Okay, Deborah Bells, you're unmuted.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. A quick question, and I represent the California Environmental Justice Alliance. A quick question related to the need allocation. Are you planning to have any consideration of greenhouse gases or air quality with relation to the procurement by different LSCs. I know that's a requirement in their planning. And my question is whether that will carry through to the procurement.
Deborah, it's Nathan. That's a very good question. And right now the proposal does not include such criteria because that would go into, well, I guess one way it would flow into real world procurement would be through resource valuation of basically having some kind of, whether it be adder, decrement, et cetera, requirement that either had a quantitative or qualitative aspect to it that could help you kind of rank bid. But you might also be thinking of something that's just more hard and fast, just rule. And if you have recommendations, we're definitely all ears. But thank you for that.
Great, thank you.
Doug Carpa, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hi, this is...
I'm
Doug,
sorry.
we just lost you.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, no, I apologize. This has already been asked because I missed a section of the questions. But on the geothermal, so this is going back to the prior section, if that's okay. On the geothermal requirement and the long duration storage, there's certainly, some indication in the record that long duration storage is called for, like in the RSP. But on the geothermal side, it's a little thinner, shall we say, the sort of the analysis behind that. And I'm wondering if you all considered, instead of having a technology specific recommendation or requirement for geothermal specifically, whether that might be recouched in terms of performance characteristics of like baseload renewables that, for example, biogas or biomass might be able to do the same thing, or even potentially a hybrid like solar and a whole lot of wind that can also, say, provide 24-hour generation. And in part, some of the questions motivated by concerns about just how very limited the supply of geothermal probably is going to be over the next few years, because there's just not much in the queue, and there's not a lot of new resource out there to be pursued.
Doug, those are good points. I particularly am kind of curious about the criteria-based ordering that you referenced. And if you have specific proposals on how to enact that, it'd be very helpful to have in comments, whether that's like hours of availability or other performance characteristics that aren't technology specific. Perhaps that's something that we could consider because that's interesting.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to work on that.
Okay, Michael Colvin, you're unmuted.
Thank you so much. Michael Colvin, an Environmental Defense Fund. Bringing us back into the questions in this section, I wanted to go into the two different methodologies of switching load shift. And the observation that I would make is that if we were to continue down the path of a cost allocation methodology and switching over existing assets, we are probably switching over older units and not making as much progress on some of our clean energy goals, whereas if we were switching over new procurement obligations under the other proposed methodology, we'll probably be procuring cleaner, relatively newer units that are out there. And that seems to be a discrepancy that maybe isn't what the staff was wanting to tee up. So I'm wondering if there is a way to make it so that whether it's cost allocation methodology or this new peak load requirement that you have, so that the overall environmental content of the power that's being transferred from one serving entity to the other is essentially indifferent, that the customer doesn't notice. I'm wondering if you all had thoughts on that, or if it's something you just want us to refer to in comments. We can do that, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Michael, it's an interesting point, and I might ask you to try to connect the dots for everybody, perhaps in comment. I don't quite follow the logic of one method being more likely to, say, procure greener resources than the other. But if this is something that you've thought through, we are definitely all ears.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for that. I also quickly, since Michael just brought up some related material, want to kind of revisit the answer that I provided Mark Specht a couple minutes ago during the previous Q&A regarding emissions, basically assurance of emissions drop or non-increase as a result of this procurement? And I don't think I gave a totally satisfying answer, so let me try to give a little bit more context. So first, what's a little bit difficult and what adds some uncertainty to this exercise is that we can order the procurement of resources, but controlling their dispatch is way further away from CPUC's control, so to speak. So while I provided an opinion that I don't think that this procurement would lead to any negative outcomes, controlling the actual dispatch of the resources is a whole different animal. What we're also proposing here is technology-specific resource callouts that could be, say, more of a match of replacing the things that are going away by having some firm dispatchable capacity that Neil mentioned in his section. We also have procurement, say, in RPS and other parts of CPUC proceedings that's in flight that could help carry us through the kind of GHG bumpiness that Mark mentioned. And he had a final part to his question about thermal. We do have, as I think you guys might have noticed in the ruling, a higher hurdle for the proposed procurement of thermal resources. It's currently listed as an application instead of an advice letter. We're also curious about the possible universe of those sorts of thermal upgrades that might be out there. It's possible that there might not be a whole lot. But for those that are curious about this or have proposals, please do put them in comments. Sorry about that detour. David, let's try to give this Q&A a couple more minutes because I want to get everyone heard.
Sounds good. Mary Lynch, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, James. I had a few questions about some of the details of the allocation and then just a couple of observations as well. First, have you considered at all, what it is in our, market design and state of the market that contributes to some LSEs being so over procured? And I'm specifically referring to the work going on in the PCIA docket that has looked at addressing the fact that the IOUs have more than they need and ways to get that back into the marketplace, but none of that has happened yet. And so I think that I'd like to encourage you to consider whether this idea of allocating based on short is really a fair mechanism to use, and we're going to think about it some more too. But I think that there are sort of some missing steps or considerations in there. Have you thought about that at all?
We are aware that there are various considerations happening right now in PCIA and PCI Working Group 3. I'm not aware of there being any final outcome to those efforts as of right now. But we're aware that something may be coming. So it's not explicitly considered here in the ruling. But if you have ideas or more insight into what's happening in the PCIA and want to connect the dots between how that should affect need allocation, then please do submit those in the comments. Yeah.
Okay. And then as you and I have discussed during the IRP process, there really, at least for Constellation, were some serious problems with the load forecast that was attributed to us. And I think that Mr. Montoya at San Diego raised a similar concern about the load forecasts there. So if those forecasts are going to be used as the premise for the need allocation, I think that there needs to be a much more thorough vetting of some of those problems as well. And then just on a couple of quick questions, you mentioned that the 3,300 that is being procured under the November order will be reflected here. Does that mean that the 7,500 is really 3,300 less than that?
So the 3,300 in both the need determination and in need allocation is assumed to be fully subscribed to. So the 7,500 was set with an assumption that that LSEs achieve the D19 orders, as were the individual LSE positions.
Okay, so the 7,500 is incremental to the 3,300.
Correct.
Okay, and then with respect to using the templates in the IRP for determining this net short, is it correct that you're just going to be using the portion of the template that reflects RA? So in other words, if there are contracts reflected on the energy side of an entity's IRP, but that didn't carry RA into the RA portion of the templates, those contracts won't have any counting with respect to the allocation of this requirement the way you're envisioning it?
So the question is, it would energy only contracts that don't have a capacity value attached be considered in the open position?
Yes.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I might ask Aaron on the line if he knows the answer to that. We might have to follow up with you on that.
Okay, and that's fine. I would just note that if it isn't using the energy only contracts, I get that, but there is RA that goes with those somewhere, and I don't know if they're, you know, reflected anywhere in the numbers. You know, that's all. It's just something that you might want to consider. And then let's see. I think the last thing that I had is when you were talking about the options for dealing with load migration, you were talking about, I think it was option 2, only about that the allocation could be restated on an annual basis, not allocation of the costs, right? So if a ESP goes out and invests in a resource based on the stated load obligation, but the load migrates, you would just be allocating that need to somewhere else. The ESP's ability to save money based on that load migration would depend on its ability to sell off at the length in its contracts. Is that correct?
I believe under the option, if you refer to the option where the actual need obligation gets shifted, then the cost shift would occur in that the LSE whose need has left no longer has to procure those resources.
Or no longer has to demonstrate them, but they might have already procured them. I mean, because this procurement is being done in advance of the need. So monetarily, they're exposed. They can only manage their costs by selling these separately into the market if there's a market for them.
But the concept would be that the market, there is a market because the load's gone somewhere else and their allocation is increased. So there's
presumably, unless that entity has already over procured for some reason, as some do. So but I just wanted to verify you don't intend to take care of allocating ESP's cost to someone else, right?
Well, yeah.
I think we're going to. Sorry, I think we're going to get into this a little bit in the next section. But
oh, okay, that's fine then. I can wait till then.
Take a couple more questions.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Oh, James, just to confirm your question, the current model is just based on capacity resources. So if an LSE is buying something energy only, then the other LSE that has the capacity, the RA portion of that project, it will be reflected in their position.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right, let's try one or two more. Danielle Mills, you're unmuted.
Hi, thanks everyone. This is a really helpful workshop. I'm Danielle Mills with American Clean Power California. We represent developers many of whom are committed to bringing projects online in order to meet both near-term and mid-term reliability with a suite of wind, solar, and storage resources. We are concerned that the TPP scenarios that were transmitted recently don't reflect this level of procurement in the ruling. And wonder if you could kind of address that. And also, especially when we're considering project viability and full project viability, we are also hearing of significant interconnection delays and delayed transmission upgrade approvals that could potentially affect the viability of otherwise very viable renewable resources to help serve this reliability need. So just wonder if you could address that quickly.
Good question. I can take a stab. Neil, feel free to jump in. But regarding the first part, so the TPP portfolio call it consistency. For mapping resources in the TPP portfolios, we do have to engage in, I'll call it science and art. So the TPP portfolios start with basically modeling results, call it the science. And then humans after that, call it the art, kind of manually move around those resources and sometimes make adjustments to how much of each technology type are in the portfolios. What we try to pass CAISO is something that meets all the criteria that we've all agreed upon and I think are publicly available, but also seeks to give at least an indicative representation of what we think the grid might look like. Because we all know that the portfolios, especially out to 2031 that we pass them, aren't going to show up exactly as planned. But within kind of some wiggle room, we try to find room in the transmission system for resource types, call them attributes. So it's very possible that there's headroom for the resource types that are contained within this procurement proposal, even though they appear in excess of what we just passed CAISO for TPP, particularly for geothermal and maybe for long duration storage. Your second point.
I was just going to add, like, I think your the context slide you had about what the RSP portfolio looked like and it's the scale of the procurement identified in the RSP mid-decade is comparable to this order. I think that's important. So sorry, the RSP is the base case for the TPP that Danielle's referring to.
And regarding her point on transmission delays and interconnection approvals, that's something that's a little bit out of scope of this proposal, but something that we are in parallel seeking to resolve. So thank you for the comment. Could we do one more question before moving on, David?
Ellen Wolf, could you go real quick? You're unmuted.
Thank you. And my question's kind of similar to what Danielle just asked and also what Doug Carpa talked about. I don't think with respect to geothermal that it's really a matter of geothermal not existing and being available out there. It's more a matter of difficulty interconnecting it to the CAISO grid or delivering it to the CAISO grid. So along the lines of what Danielle asked, especially for these types of resources like geothermal that you want to have procured by 2025, it seems really important to get that level of geothermal resource in the IRP portfolio for the CAISO, or otherwise get the CAISO to look at that starting in this cycle and not waiting until 2022 to start that investigation. So I guess I just would echo a little bit Doug's concern, but especially Danielle's concern that if they don't have that instruction to look for, especially the geothermal that is connected to the grid in a way that it can count for RA, meaning it needs to come right into the CAISO or some mechanism needs to be available, that's going to be a real challenge for LSUs to contract for that by 2025.
It'd be very helpful to see, like, if you could point to sources of your concerns about geothermal's ability to interconnect with the CAISO. I think geothermal has been studied in past base cases in the TPP, and the TPP materials transmitted recently contained discussion about whether the level of geothermal in that portfolio could be accommodated on existing transmission, and my understanding is it can be. So.
Okay. Well, I think
yeah.
Will do. Yeah. I think it's just a matter of whether it's on the CAISO grid or not, because if it's outside the CAISO grid, then getting the maximum import capability to demonstrate it's available for RA is just virtually impossible these days. I had one other question too about ASEMS, and I'll raise it now. If you don't want to answer it, you can table it until the end in case you have time. But there's other discussions going on in the RA docket about changes to counting rules for ELCC for certain wind and solar, be it marginal, locational, that sort of thing. Would you expect that as ELCC methodologies are updated, that those updated methods would be applied to demonstrate meeting the NQC requirements?
Not necessarily.
That's a good question.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Neil.
Yes. I think the ruling proposes an approach to deal with the matter I think you're talking about, Ellen, in regards to compliance, and we'll be covering that shortly. But it's a matter for the system RA proceeding what accounting values it sets for each horizon.
But whatever the current counting is at the time the demonstration is required, you'd expect to use that.
No, I don't feel that's not what I'm saying. The ruling proposes an alternative.
Yeah, Ellen, we might have to move on, but please take a look at the ruling. And I'll just highlight that, you know, there's two different proceedings in play here in two different timeframes. And what we might do might be independent of what's in RA, but yet still in communication with them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we'll turn to procurement any direction, backstop procurement and cost allocation. So closely related to need allocation, but with some important distinctions here. Procurement any direction is getting to what actual entities contract with the resources or own the resources to meet the procurement need, as distinct from which LSCs are allocated the need. They can be different. So the first IRP order for 3,300 megawatts gave non-IOUs the opportunity to opt out. They still bear the cost of procurement, but that they have the IOUs procure on their behalf if they opted for that. Whereas this ruling proposes that non-IOUs, as well as the IOUs, are required to self-provide. So that's a difference. In the case of the geothermal long duration storage, the ruling states that LSCs would be encouraged to conduct that procurement jointly. And just a further note that operating entity is a term that gets used in the ruling questions, one of the ruling questions, and that's just getting at you know, the entity that actually deals with the scheduling of a resources output, it's managing its maintenance schedule, controlling other activities that are critical for its performance post-construction. Question there about what that entity sort of requirement should be, and which is particularly pertinent if the resource is serving multiple LSEs. Okay, so then backstop procurement. Now this term we use to mean basically what happens in the event of procurement being delayed or failing. Is procurement required to fill that? So that's what meant by backstop. The ruling proposes that the IOUs would be required to backstop if non-IOUs fail or don't comply, fail or delay. And now the challenge that lies within this is balancing ensuring enough capacity comes online for reliability, but not triggering procurement which could be duplicative and costly. So that's what's underlying this. The ruling addresses this issue for the two broad categories of resources differently. So firstly, with the geothermal and long duration storage, it points to August 2023 as a key milestone that's proposed, whereby LSCs would demonstrate their progress in jointly procuring the geothermal long duration storage, and then based on that, the Commission can determine whether there's a need to appoint the IOU to take that over to the extent that there's unsatisfactory progress. With regard to the other resources, the balance of the 7.5 gigawatts, the ruling proposes using the approach that was reasonably formalized for the first procurement order in a decision in December. And essentially that approach requires the self-providing LSEs to file twice a year showing their progress, and then with backstop potentially being triggered once a year. And so moving on to cost allocation, this next slide here is drawn from the procurement framework staff proposal, just some background on the terminology and concepts. I won't read through it all, but it just tries to call out that cost allocation is required when there's a disconnect between the need allocation and then the procurement entities performing the procurement. The CAM, the cost allocation mechanism, is familiar to many. That's been used for a long time, but is limited when it can be used. It's really limited to when the IOUs are conducting procurement on behalf of all customers in their territory, which is not the default approach proposed here. So then we look at modified CAM, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. So just repeating by the ruling proposing self-provision, that is a difference with the first procurement order, and it does help to reduce the amount of cost allocation that needs to be worked out. It basically leaves two sources of cost allocation, one being load shift, load migration, and the other being if there's backstop. So based on how James flagged it earlier, this way of dealing with cost allocation, I guess he's calling the sort of after the fact approach rather than in the order. The ruling actually proposes this. We could draw upon the PCIA process to deal with this. So, for example, an LSE gets allocated their need based on the latest available LSE load shares at the time of the order this year. Let's say they sign a contract for a fraction of their obligation during 2022, and then a significant portion of their load departs after that in 2023. Should the 2023 vintages of customers departing the IOU bear the cost of their portion of just the contract signed in 2022, or of the eventual cost of all the contracts needed to meet the IOU's allocation? I think that's what the ruling questions get at in part. And so that sort of leads to the question, would the current PCIA be able to be used to implement this, or would it need to be changed to do this equitably? So feedback on that, I think, would be very helpful. And then finally, just back to backstop. This is the other potential source of needing to allocate costs. So you've got potentially one LSE procuring on behalf of others, requiring that requires cost allocation. And so that's where the modified CAM, which is required from the first IRP procurement order, could be relevant here. The modified CAM is attempting to address backstop, but it's also attempting to address the opt-out option of that first IRP procurement order. So not all of it is relevant here, just a narrow portion, but the ruling proposes that it be considered. So feedback on that would be valuable as well. So that's all I plan to cover for this, and so would welcome questions on these topics of procurement, any direction, backstop, and cost allocation.
And thanks for that, Neil. A housekeeping note on questions, just two notes. First, please try to keep your questions minimized to clarifying questions. We've gotten a fair amount of advocacy, and we do want to give parties the opportunity to kind of express opinions when there's time, but now that we're in a time crunch, please just clarifying questions about the content, and please try to not have multi-layer questions that kind of keep going. Forgive my intrusion here, but David?
Raised hand function on the WebEx or *3 on the phone. Gene Nelson, you're unmuted.
Yep. Okay, well, this was actually from the first Q&A, so I hope I can get that question addressed now. And that is, Californians for Green Nuclear Power expresses its concerns regarding the proposed incremental procurement of 1,000 megawatts of geothermal generation in this proceeding. Previously, CGNP raised concerns before the CPUC and FERC regarding the harmful aftermath of a large earthquake on the southern section of the San Andreas Fault. The forecast recurrence interval for this earthquake is about 300 years, so it's already overdue. I'm going to skip for succinctness and just get to this. Geothermal development typically includes the injection of large quantities of water into the subsurface strata. Given the experience with water injection initiating large earthquakes in Oklahoma by lubricating the strata after fracking began there, CGNP is concerned that geothermal development on or near the San Andreas Fault could be the trigger for the southern San Andreas shakeout scenario. CGNP advises new California geothermal development should occur only in locations far removed from active earthquake faults to avoid triggering earthquakes. That's my concern. I hope that the PUC addresses that because they've been silent on it so far. That's the end of it.
Thank you, Gene.
Steve Metigue, you're unmuted.
Great, thank you. Very helpful presentation. My comments probably go back to the first section and they regard transmission again. I know you described some things to Danielle and Ellen in earlier questions. I guess I'm a little confused how the grid is going to be able to accommodate the 7.5 gigawatts of new NQC. And I'd be interested to hear maybe if someone could explain that to me, and if there is confidence, and I thought I heard the word, there's confidence related to the existing headroom in the system, where is that confidence springing from?
I can take a stab at that. I think Neil and I tried to answer this in response to some questions last Q&A, but in short, the portfolios that we pass over to Kaiser for their transmission planning process, where we would kind of be making that assessment of whether there's headroom or not, quote unquote, are based on resolve analysis that we showed earlier in the slide that show a nameplate capacity amount that is roughly consistent with what we propose to order here in the mid-decade timeframe. That we assume would be, I guess, then consistent with being able to map effectively resources to the transmission system in a way that can give us an indication of whether all those resources that are in the reference system plan that we adopted last year and the portfolios that we just passed CPP a month ago are actually going to trigger transmission or not.
So just one quick follow-up. So you're saying the reference system plan from last year had just as many resources in it as this procurement order is proposed to have?
It's approximately, yes. It has a similar amount of NQC resources, which is what we define this proposed procurement order in, though its resource composition could change given what LSCs actually decide to go procure.
Okay, Scott Olson, you're unmuted.
Great, thank you. This is Scott Olson with Direct Energy. Thanks, Neil, for the presentation. On this specific section, it seemed a little bit unclear if the geothermal and long duration storage will be treated different than the generic resources that are being asked for procurement. This particular section of the proposal says that LSEs are encouraged to work together and that there'll be potential timing to determine if backstop needs to actually get called. So do you envision that geothermal and long duration storage might be handled differently in terms of LSEs may be able to not necessarily opt out, but have a different approach for its procurement relative to the 5,500 megawatts?
Yes, that's my understanding from the ruling, is that, basically LSCs self-organize and determine whether they want to jointly or individually procure these large, potentially large resources. And so then the milestone by which they demonstrate progress is distinct. I think that's a distinction I tried to make earlier. That'd be August 2023, where their progress in doing so would be shown to the Commission, and whereas the timings for the generic, the other all source resources would be on a different schedule. I think the first showing for that would be
one of the concerns that ESPs have that we'll bring up is that unlike CCAs and IOUs as competitors, we're not really allowed to jointly procure. So it puts us a bit of a disadvantage about how we can go about doing this. So we'll put this more into comments, but we would like there to be some additional consideration for not necessarily an opt-out approach, but a way that this handles differently in terms of how it's procured, as well as penalties for if it's not procured specifically on an LSE by LSE basis. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just one more real quick. Nina Robertson, you're unmuted.
Hi, thank you. Two questions. The first is when do you expect to compile the preferred system plan? And
Nina,
the
we're having
second,
a little trouble hearing you. Could you get closer to your microphone?
oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can. Thanks.
Yes. When do you expect to have the preferred system plan compiled? And my second question is whether you've considered CAISA's general study about local attributes needed in local areas.
I can try to answer the first one. I'm not certain if we're going to have an immediate answer to the second one, but the preferred system plan development is actually already underway here at CPUC. We're hoping by the middle of this year, maybe as early as Q2, to have a public version of it out there in preliminary form. Neil or others, do you think that we have the answer to our second question at our fingertips?
No, and I'm trying to connect it to the procurement, but don't know enough about it. Know enough about it. Sorry.
Thank you.
Let's try to move on to the last section.
Right. Last section: approval, compliance, enforcement. Okay, so on the approval side of things, this is applicable to IOUs only. This is the process the IOUs go through, and potentially in future central procurement entities go through to gain approval to recover costs from ratepayers. Issues here are balancing the expediency of procurement with the need for stakeholder review and the possibility of that review finding significant deficiencies. So it's a trade-off between standardized CPUC approval criteria defined upfront versus ensuring these are fit for each instance of procurement. The ruling proposes tier 3 advice letters like the first order in IRP with an option to use applications, with an exception that if an IOU proposed to procure from a fossil fuel resource, that an application be required for that. Then regarding compliance, now this applies to all LSEs. Compliant resources, essentially they can't already have been assumed to be providing capacity in the mid-decade timeframe in the need determination that we covered earlier. That's a foundational principle that the ruling proposes. So the baseline is would be as per the need determination. There'd be a need to be clear what that baseline is. I know there's a ruling question about this, and it could sort of be read as though the baseline hasn't yet been formed. It has. It's been used for the need determination. I think the challenge is it's not yet clear, as James alluded to, how to make it available to stakeholders, given confidentiality restrictions. This is an issue for the baseline as well as it is for what James is describing for need allocation. So that's what the ruling question there is getting at. And yeah, interplay with other proceedings and procurement, we've discussed the possibility of a resource that's not being assumed in the need determination baseline, and it's being driven by, say, this summer's reliability needs, could meet that as well as this new order, provided it provides resource adequacy in the mid-decade timeframe. The ruling proposes that, in general, the contracts for these new resources are at least 10 years long. I take that as basically from the online date. So if the contract's entered earlier, as it would need to be before the online date, the length of that contract is actually longer than 10 years, but the online service provision is 10 years. That's how I would interpret that. And then final point in compliance, and this is what Ellen Wolf's question I think was getting at, is like what should LSEs assume they can count resources at towards meeting their need allocation? So the proposal here in the ruling is distinct from the first IRP order. This is a shift, is that it's based on the marginal ELCC that's projected by the CPUC for each resource type for each year. So drawing back to the need determination slides, this is really just relevant for wind, solar, and batteries, and hybrids. And so, whereas other resource types would just maintain a consistent NQC percentage. I think then on to penalties, also known as sort of enforcement part of the procurement process. The ruling proposes that in addition to backstop provisions, that a penalty for failure be applied. And so this would be, unlike the backstop provision, which is for the non-IUs only, this would be applicable to all LSEs. And the ruling proposes that this refers to a cost of new entry reference point. Look, it points to a CEC source. We've had at least one staker ask where this source can be found and what specifically is it. And looking into this, staff can see that a better option might be the cost of new entry that's calculated for the avoided cost calculator and is publicly available already for the IDER proceeding. Believe it refers to battery storage with the principle that it's the marginal resource, which currently it's probably battery storage. But it would be helpful if parties familiar with this could comment on whether that's a suitable source as part of the overall question on what role should a penalty play in the proposed procurement. And then just to close the content of the ruling with thinking about future procurement and IRP, the ruling section is actually titled Relationship with Potential Procurement Coming from the Preferred System Plan later this year. But I think it applies to future procurement and IRP in general. And look, in some sense, these ideas are not urgent to address, but the ruling asks for comment on the issues here, and I think you know it does a good job of highlighting the first IRP order and you know the proposed arrangements for this midterm order and potentially future orders. They're all according to this paradigm of ordering and determining baselines and incrementality, etc. And so the ruling, you know, asks the question: is a more programmatic paradigm better, possible, better, and should be considered? And so I think it's urgent in the sense to think about this when we've got important procurement coming up, and could it transition to could it still occur, but transition to a programmatic or other paradigms that can be thought of in due course. Yeah, so the ruling highlights the complexity of tracking multiple baselines with multiple procurement orders. But I think also the discussion about load migration earlier and resource eligibility, those challenges may be helped by a programmatic approach. And so, yeah, the ruling seeks comment on this, and it points to like a resource adequacy program as a potential way of doing it. I don't think that necessarily means the short-term system RA program, but conceptually something like that for mid to longer-term resource adequacy. So that wraps up the content on this final portion. And so we've got a few minutes to tackle questions specific to this, and then we could just broaden out the workshop.
Thanks, Neil. And at the end of this Q&A, I have a couple loose ends to tie up to.
Greg Morris, you have your hand up. You're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Greg Morris of the Green Power Institute. And mine was a question that I've been waiting to ask for quite a while. It's not really a question. I just would like to suggest that you're misusing the term geothermal. I think what you really mean is baseload renewable, of which geothermal is one but not all of the candidate resources. Baseload renewables include biomass and biogas as well as geothermal. And I don't see any reason why you would want to prejudice the outcome of the analysis at this point in time. It may be that it would be 100% geothermal, and it may be that it wouldn't, but let's at least leave it open to baseload renewable rather than just geothermal.
Greg, thanks for that. I think that's consistent with Doug Carper's comment earlier about call it attribute-based ordering. So if you want to put that in comments, I think that that would be helpful. Thank you.
We will, thank you.
All right, hands raised. If you've not dropped your hand from a previous question, please do so. *3 on the phone. Mary Neal, do you have another question? You're on mute.
Yeah, I have a question about the penalties. You've accelerated the year of need in this proposal, and I'm wondering if the penalties would apply to the accelerated timeline or the actual year of need.
I believe it would be the accelerated. So it's basically turning what would be like a exact amount and like the latest possible moment of the need into the proposal is to bring it a year forward, and that becomes the procurement required. So that penalty would be applied to that.
But doesn't that, I mean, that makes it so that, LSCs might have to try and target even in advance of the accelerated timeline to make sure that there's no delays and they're not penalized, right? Isn't that sort of double counting that?
Sure. I mean, you don't want to build risk mitigation on risk mitigation endlessly, but yeah, the ruling does propose that that mitigation, and I think it does invite comment on that matter.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Mary. David, I'm going to take a guess on two names here that may have not been called on yet. Damon Franz and Jim Caldwell.
Jim Caldwell, you're unmuted.
Thanks. I hate to pile on to the transmission question, but I think that there's an important point here, and that is when you replied to all the folks about whether there is enough transmission, you referred back to the TPP as saying that that's probably true. But I think it's critical to point out that the TPP is a planning and approval document, and it does not cover execution or construction of what has been planned and approved. And if you look behind that, in the southern side, let's say in SCE and SDG&E territory, there are, let's call them important, if not critical, network upgrades that have been approved but not constructed, and their CODs fall in the time frame of this procurement. So these are mostly deliverability related, so they relate to the end in NQC, but it's enough that you need to worry about it this procurement. In the PG&E service territory, it's much more related to the QC side, or the interconnection of two facilities, and the NQC is hopefully, is even out there beyond that. So I think you guys, the staff here and the commissioners, need to pay serious attention to the execution of the planned network upgrades for deliverability and interconnection in this procurement, or it'll change things dramatically. With that, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Jimmy. Look forward to hearing that in comments. I didn't hear particular questions, but
believe me, you'll get them.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah. Jim, if you have, this is Molly Sterkel. Jim, if you have specific suggestions about what the CPUC or the CAISO can be doing to be tracking the planned network upgrades, now is the time to provide that, both in our comments here as well as in the TPP study plan process, where comments are being submitted.
Okay, one specific comment that I have that doesn't fall neatly into any proceeding is the ongoing issues with the AB 970 reports, which for the past 20 years is where all of that public information is. Yeah. And those are going dark, and this is the wrong time to do that.
Okay, so Jim, I can fill you in on those reports offline, and I can put that in the answers workshop. Yeah.
Make sure that somebody's looking at this. I'll call you, Molly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, those reports are not dark. They're continuing, but they have new names. So we'll put that.
No, they're not. That's the point. I'll call you.
Okay.
Damon Franz, you're unmuted. Damon. Damon
Franz. Going once, going twice. Okay, do you see any other new names, David? Otherwise, there's a couple items I'd like to tie off.
You go ahead.
All right, thanks for that. So back towards the beginning, forget who it was. It might have been Mary Neal, was asking about basically, especially in Servum, were we assuming 4.5% or 6% in terms of reserves? The answer was 4.5. And what we'd be proposing here, if we were to make Servum consistent with this, would be to moving that up to 6. I also have a plug for, I guess, maybe putting a finer point on, if we were to go back to maybe the high case slide, and David, I don't know if you have to do that right now, but just to kind of get parties' attention focused on potential assumptions change that you might want to look at is we did not explicitly capture in our high case any uncertainty around possible Aliso Canyon column consequences that might come from, say, reduced usage or closage of that facility, particularly on, say, the availability of natural gas in that geography. So if you think as a party that there could be factors there that we should be considering, we have been coordinating internally, but we're curious on your thoughts about are we missing something in terms of maybe megawatts that we should assume wouldn't be available for reliability reasons due to Aliso-related reasons. And lastly, I think, Neil, you might have some closing comments, but before that, the big thing that I want parties to focus on was kind of touched on earlier. Basically, PRM type conversation, particularly what does the 2 gigawatt adder mean? I think that Aaron summed it up best in the response maybe to Natasha of basically the 2 gigawatt adder that we have starting from the reference system plan days represents the best information that we have of kind of results of iterating between our capacity expansion model Resolve and our production cost model Servum, whereby when we put Resolve portfolios into Servum, we realized that we needed to kind of tell Resolve to build to a higher peak in order to actually meet Servum's 0.1 loss of load standard. It's possible that there's a variety of things in that 2 gigawatt adder, some of which could be still calibration issues, but some of which could be other, call it uncertainty, that we're still trying to put our finger on, but is nonetheless important and possibly appropriate for future planning efforts. So I'd love to get party attention on that. I imagine that a bunch of you already were going to be doing so in your comments. Otherwise, Neil, I think I can hand it back to you.
Thanks, Nathan. Next steps, just to wrap up. Thanks for all the questions. This is the comments and reply schedule where we're aware there's an extension being sought, and I'll just note that that's being considered. And then the plan is to potentially have a proposed decision and decision in Q2 of this year. So I will just close. I don't think we've got time for any further questions, but I want to thank the presenting team, David and Ali for hosting, Aaron, Burdick, and Charlie Duff for all the contribution and preparation. And then finally, thanks very much for everyone who's attended to the questions and the very good questions we've had. Really appreciate that. And I know we look forward to your comments and look forward to continue working with you on this. So with that, I think we can close the workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nathan and team. Bye.
David and Ali, I'm not seeing any unanswered questions from the chat.
I had a few, and I'm just copying it right now.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah. Which I'll send to you. Okay, let's close out here.
All right, thanks, guys.